Welcome to the Tudor Dixon podcast. Today, I have a great guest with me. Her name is Laura Becker. She is an artist and also a detransitioner activist, which I find fascinating because I think we've heard so much, especially in this last race about this last election, about the trans community and sensitivities to the trans community. I think a lot of people find the ads on the Republican side frustrating. And then on the Republican side, people are saying, gosh, I think they might have been effective. So I thought, what a great time to get to talk to Laura, because Laura, you've been through this. You actually went through you had a terribly abusive childhood and then had sort of, it sounds like people push you into the transgender movement and you've come out of that. You wanted to talk about that. So I appreciate you being willing to come on and be vulnerable. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Tudor. And I'm just grateful to be able to share this story because I think people are hungry for it. And it's about time we start telling the truth.
Well, let's do that because I think that from the perspective of someone who hasn't gone through this, I've had people around me that have had I wouldn't say necessarily they've had friends that have gone through the transition. And so far they're very young. They are very new to the process. So I haven't had a lot of experience with people who have come back and said, this didn't go the way I thought it would. But I've read a lot of things where people have had a lot of regrets, especially I think male to female transition because of the massive surgery, the what they call the bottom surgery and the repercussions of that afterward. So if you can just share what you experienced and how you decided this actually isn't for me.
Yeah, so it is a long story. That's why I do have a memoir that'll be coming out next year. But to kind of give a synopsis, I was, raised in I was raised in Wisconsin, kind of a bit sheltered, had a pretty good childhood overall, but around the time when I started to go through middle childhood, there was abuse in my family, chronic abuse from my father, psychological, verbal, and emotional abuse. And that severely damaged my self-esteem. I felt completely worthless. And that's about the time I was going through puberty. And I started experiencing a lot of social issues, emotional issues. I was diagnosed on the autism spectrum. And so I just had a whole host of things going on top of already adolescence. And so by the time I hit high school, I'm Gen Z. So this was kind of when social media started exploding and no one had ever seen anything like this before. So I became hyper online because that's what autistic, socially awkward kids do. And I was socializing on Tumblr. I was socializing on these very far leftist social media sites where kind of all the quirky, artsy kids would hang out, which is great.
What happens on Tumblr? I am totally ignorant to what Tumblr even is. If you can explain that a little bit.
Yeah. So Tumblr was kind of like an alternative to Facebook, where Facebook was kind of for older people. Maybe your parents were on there, aunts and uncles. Tumblr was
I was on there.
Yes, that's okay. That's okay.
No, I'm just joking.
You wouldn't have been cool when I was growing up, but neither was I. That's okay. But Tumblr had, that's kind of where we're seeing a lot of memes. We're seeing a lot of really dark jokes, a lot of art, a lot of fandoms for TV shows like Supernatural, or kind of like where nerdy, artsy, kind of intellectual, quirky kids would hang out. There was many great things to Tumblr. It helped me to have a social life for the first time in a long time. But it also had a really dark side. There was a lot of pornography. There was a lot of glorification of self-harm, cutting, eating disorders. And it was also completely far left. So that's when I started learning about wokeism. And I, at first, viewed it all as, this is so liberating, and we're going to be feminist, and we're going to fight the patriarchy, and Black Lives Matter, and all that kind of stuff. And when you're a teen, it sounds all good until you grow up and you hit the real world. Unfortunately, I hit the real world in a really severe way because I already had this trauma that was going on. I didn't know I had PTSD, but I'd already developed complex PTSD from the parental abuse. And so I was on Tumblr around 15, started finding queer and transgender ideology. And the ideology was telling me that if I didn't feel comfortable in my body, if I felt like a tomboy, and which I was, and I was very nonconforming, and because I'm autistic, so of course I'm gender nonconforming. I'm just a little eccentric in general. So I was like, oh, this perfectly describes me. I've always been a tomboy. I don't relate to feminine stereotypes. And I was very attracted to men. And so I'm like, okay, well, I'm not a lesbian. So, like, but I'm definitely kind of different and I don't really understand it. And so I adopted this non binary label and this kind of queer label. Unfortunately, what also comes with the queer label is the political side of queerness. Queerness isn't just being gay or trans. Queerness is a political identity where we're developing this far leftist ideology to kind of instigate rebellion, instigate the kind of these intellectual, naive young people to basically become communists. It's a Marxist ideology if we read the literature of where it came from. So I
Wait,
didn't know.
whoa, I had no idea. This is totally, this is like a huge revelation to
Oh,
me.
yeah.
What?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's
So,
when, is this like widely known that that's what queer is?
well, James Lindsay, I don't know if you know James, but he's kind of been popularizing this because he's gone through and read all of where the queer theory comes from. And it comes from postmodernist theory. And the postmodernists were all about deconstruction. And if we think about the language of deconstruction, it's basically critiquing something that's normal and mostly good, and then nitpicking it until we only find flaws. It's a very nihilistic philosophy. And so if we look at like decolonization, decentering your whiteness, decentering your heterosexuality, these kind of ideas that are popular right now, or at least they're kind of dying off now, I hope, but they've been prevalent. It actually comes from this Marxist laden kind of spiritual philosophy that these new age philosophers were writing about, including the gender theorists like Judith Butler, who was popularizing the idea of gender identity, where there really isn't any difference between male or female. It's all performative. And so a girl or boy could be socialized to, be whatever sex or gender they call it, regardless of like any type of evolutionary biology, which of course we know isn't true, but it's a nice thought. Like if we want to fight inequality between the sexes, especially for women, it's a nice thought. It's a nice fantasy. But unfortunately, that fantasy really, really harmed me and is harming a large number of young people today because I had this magical thinking from trauma that, if I basically I had this kind of love addiction problem where, because of abuse from my father, I was just kind of getting attached to anyone that would come around. It's very common. And so I was getting attached sexually and romantically to these gay male friends of mine. And we were all teenagers and we all believed in queerness. So we all believed, oh, well, our body parts shouldn't matter and genitals shouldn't matter. But genitals do matter, guys, when it comes to sex. And unfortunately, I was, heterosexual and really struggling with suicide ideation and all of these things. And my gay male friends didn't reciprocate my sexual feelings. And so all of these things combined into this horrific existential crisis where I felt like I couldn't be accepted or loved or that I wasn't right in my own body as a female. And the ideology says that if you feel that way, that means you're trans. That's called gender dysphoria. And so I, was experiencing really severe gender dysphoria. I was ruminating on my genitalia and all these things I hated about myself and debating if I was transgender. And so by the time that I went to my first semester of college, I was well deep taking classes in queer theory, women and gender studies, all the type of typical woke stuff you would take. And that's when I came out as a gay trans man. So basically, I was just a traumatized straight girl who was very confused. And unfortunately, I just didn't have safe adults in my life telling
Do you
me
think
otherwise.
like a Tumblr, what you were talking about, do you think that that is a place that's kind of a predatory place where they're seeking out people that are in this situation? Because I mean, what I'm hearing from you, I'm like, gosh, how many people in high school feel this way? And obviously you were also experiencing trauma, but high school is kind of a time when you just don't know who you are. I mean, you're going through puberty, everything feels wrong. You feel you're looking at your friends, why don't I look like that? Why don't I look like this? There's just all kinds of pressures on you. Is there a dark path on the web that is like, come here, it's like the witch and Hansel and Gretel, only this is real life, and the witch is going to destroy your life.
Yeah, that's a really good way to describe it. Pretty much every detransitioner that I know describes it as a cult. So the transgender cult is very prevalent online, and so there's two types of kind of groomers. There's people that are kind of similar aged peers, like probably college aged, usually women that are also mentally ill. And they're not meaning to hurt anyone. They're not like sexual predators necessarily, but they're enabling people's delusions, and they're kind of evangelizing this idea of queerness and evangelizing this idea of transgenderism. And so we're seeing that on Tumblr, TikTok, Reddit, Instagram, YouTube. We'll have these kind of TikTok famous trans influencers that are evangelizing to these younger kids and other struggling people that here's how you get hormones for free. Here's how you get surgery paid for by insurance. Here's how you do all this. And so all the detransitioners view it as a cult because they really are recruiting you. It's not like the gay and lesbian sort of civil rights movements of the past where it was like these people are very lonely and then they find each other and they're just trying to live their lives.
That's what I think has been so hard for people to understand, because I grew up with, and even in high school, I grew up with a kid, and you just knew that he was gay, and that was going to be his life story. And he's married to a man now, and that to me is like, it's not a surprise. We all knew that was the case, And I think that everybody has kind of accepted that happens. There are women who love women, there are men who love men. It's this idea of cutting off your body parts, and how does this happen so quickly to children so young? I think that's been the part where people went, whoa, wait a minute, what are we doing? We are putting hormones into children now as young as 10 years old, and changing their bodies and stopping them from growing. And stopping puberty isn't changing someone's gender. It's stopping them from going through what your body naturally goes through. It's totally different. And I think people are like, oh, anybody against them, they're homophobic. No, we want to protect children. I've never understood where people come out and say, how could you possibly say you want to prevent surgeries on kids under 18? Tell us what that, you've clearly met other kids that have gone through this. What is it like after they figure out, I didn't want to have that surgery?
Well, there's two parts that I want to address there. One is, how did we get here? I think that's a great question. Basically, this was all intentional. After the gay liberation movement, these activist organizations, the radical people in there, like the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, WPATH, the radical activists needed a new way to make money. After gay marriage was legalized and it's kind of, they won that fight, they needed a way to make money. And so they started pushing more radical ideologies from kind of the fringe, and then getting that spread throughout media, the Human Rights Campaign, Planned Parenthood, all of these different organizations then started pushing the trans agenda. So that's how it's become so widespread. And then it happened so quickly because it was kind of it crept in like under the umbrella of the LGBTQ, even though the LGB and the TQ are completely different.
LGB, if I were the LGB, I would be pissed.
They are. A lot of them are very pissed.
But I would be like, wait a minute, because I do think you're right. That all the gay marriage passed, and it has been accepted by most people in the United States. And then I just think people went, wait a minute. Wait, is this the movement? Because, we had pride parades, and pride parades were like people celebrating. And then they became this place where you couldn't take your kids because it was so sexual, and it had gone to such a bizarre extreme. And I think it's interesting what you said, because they needed a way to make money, because I think people don't understand that activism is an industry. There's actually a full industry built around this. I mean, just like people just saw this election, what was it like? $15 billion were spent in this election. It's similar. It's very similar. These activists they bring in money, they go different places, they travel, they have events. It is all, it's very addictive to have this grift off of something. And this is the transgender grift, but it's killing kids.
Yeah, and it's the TQ, which is all manner of degenerates possible. I mean, it's a lot of heterosexual people. They're not even gay. There's just lots of predators, or they're just very confused people. So like the most trans identified people we'll see today are like confused young women that are usually autistic type like myself, and then much older men that are fetishists. And so that's a pretty big spectrum. But they're all lumped together under the TQ, which co-opted the LGB movement and co-opted the pride flag, co-opted the pride festivals. And now it's not really about pride. It's more, and like asking for tolerance. It's more about demanding special privileges, like, men and women's sports. And as far as the children are concerned, I mean, it's absolutely horrific. Because although most who are transitioning are kind of in my situation where they find out about it as a teenager, and then once they get to the college age, then there's really no safeguards at all in medicine, in psychiatry. The parents can't do anything if the parents are, worried about it. They get there in between 18 and 25. They have their breasts cut off like I did at 20. They take testosterone or estrogen. They, are living this completely queer lifestyle where they're really just destroying their bodies in this really negative way. And then to cope with they're trying to spread it and evangelize it to others and demand this acceptance, even though they're not even accepting something as fundamental as their own biology. So it's just absolutely horrendous. And unfortunately, it's happening younger and younger. So the kids find out about it. Maybe they start transitioning when they're like around 18 or 19, but now it's being taught so prevalently in K through 12 schools. It's being taught in human resources to teachers and, professionals in every department, basically, especially in medicine, that this is the only treatment for gender dysphoria. And by the way, gender dysphoria just means discomfort. And so gender dysphoria just means some kind of vague discomfort. I actually have a theory that it's somewhat just existential anxiety projected onto the body. When a young person is going through these changes during puberty or emerging adulthood, like 18 or so, there's a lot of pressure to grow up and what am I going to do with my life? And it can be easier for the kids that usually get into this are more cerebral. So they're more interested in these abstract concepts like me. So they'll get into these ideas so that they can narrow down their options and reduce their anxiety, because they're very scared to grow up. They're very scared to become a man or woman, because we've really demonized so much. We've demonized parenthood. We've demonized motherhood, women becoming mothers, stay-at-home mothers. I mean, it connects to everything once you really understand.
So interesting, because we just had someone on the podcast not too long ago, and he was saying that there's been this trend, and he thought that the election, people didn't see what was happening in the election, because there's been this trend in the younger generation, in your generation actually, where people have started to try to seek out that traditional lifestyle of, the house with the picket fence, 2.5 kids, the marriage, all of that. And it almost feels like it's kind of split. It's gone either that people are seeking that out, or people are seeking out, how can I be as different as possible? But ultimately what I'm hearing from you, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's still a searching for love. There's still a searching for someone to be with you. And I think that's totally natural I mean, that is the idea of puberty, right? You're going through this, your body is changing, you're going to be able to have children. It's going to be a totally different life than childhood. You are growing up, you are becoming a woman, you're becoming a man. And at that moment, something seems to be happening. There seems to be this desire to, in both cases, find love, but I'm not to say that the other side can't be doing it in a dangerous manner as well. But gosh, it's like, how did we get here where people are feeling like they can't find they can't wait, or there's like an impatience in finding the right person, or being loved. Where do you think that is?
Oh, well, I definitely have had my share of romantic impatience, and I still do.
Well, we all
But
have.
it's just funny to me to hear you say that. But I mean, part of it is, kind of it comes from the toxic part of kind of like 90s feminism. Like feminism did a lot of really important things in the past, but the way that it's been co-opted and commercialized and kind of this consumption based and activist based and outrage based, we now have outlets for all of these fringe people to, get their ideas out. And it's not popular right now to talk about evolutionary biology. I mean, it is for me. It's one of my hobbies because there's a meme in the detrans world that's kind of like the detrans to trad wife pipeline is real.
That's so funny, but I'm listening to it and I'm so connecting, because it's true that you can't even talk about being for women. Like, oh my gosh, are you a feminist? And I'm like, I mean, I think of the feminism that fought like the RBG, or Ruth Bader Ginsburg generation of people who really fought for women, and I'm like, there was a feminist movement that was so needed for us. It was so needed for us to have equal rights. And then I look at this and I'm like, we have now this situation where we feel like we're fighting for women's sports, but if you fight too hard for women, you aren't traditional enough, you aren't conservative enough. And so there is this weird place for women right now.
It's really weird because we can't even acknowledge that what a woman is or a man is. And no matter what it seems like, it's not popular. I think overall, again, all of this is existential. So seeking love, seeking meaning, seeking transcendence, all of this, bettering the self through body mods, like it all comes back to the primal human impulses. But I think people are ashamed of it. And I think with our culture, we have such a disconnect from nature, such a disconnect from sort of our animalistic impulses. And that never goes well. If we try to deny our animalistic impulses, they always come back out even worse, right? So, the kind of movement away from religion which had its pros and cons, to try to mitigate some of these animalistic impulses. Now people are turning to consumption culture to try to deal with it. And they're avoiding some of these truths about male and female differences. And it's very complicated. But for women, I mean, everyone is suffering. Like I consider myself a humanist because I'm very interested in how we work as an ecosystem, how the male, the female, the child, the triangulation between all of us is very synchronous and works together. So if the male is off, if these men are feeling demoralized and they're sterilizing themselves, the women are going to be off. If the women are off, the men are off, the children are off. Everything is off right now in terms of understanding and appreciating our sex bodies. So it's not a surprise to me that there's this kind of spiritual cult right now of body modification and thinking that we can transcend all of that. Because as what detransitioners show is that doesn't really work. And then we come back and now we have to try to pick up the pieces of our lives and our 20s and 30s to try and figure out and can we even have kids? Luckily I can, but a lot of us can't. They've had hysterectomies, they have their testicles removed. I mean, this is just disgusting. And so I'm a secular person, but I like to use spiritual language to describe this like evil. I really do believe this is evil, and I think it's intentional disruption of the norm. And if you're going against the norm and what is good and what's worked for a long time, I do think that's evil because we're lying to children that there's something wrong with their bodies. We're lying to women that they can't trust their own intuition and their own eyes and sense of reality of a man is in their locker room. We're lying to men that we don't need them and men have no place in society. I mean, I'm getting worked up because it's destroyed my generation and it's destroying the younger generation.
Well, but you're making me think about my generation and the things like even body modification is not new, and it's not just trans issue, because I mean, I remember when I was a kid, you know, if somebody got their nose done, it was like, oh my gosh, so and so got their nose done. And now I look at people and I'm like, do they have any of their original parts? Like I see women walking past with their lips are different, their eyes are different, they don't look, it doesn't, and it's weird because it doesn't look younger, it doesn't look even human. It's a really weird look, but it's everywhere. I mean, I just got back from a trip overseas and I thought it was an American thing. But it was not an American thing. I'm like, everybody has this weird fake face. And I think we've become this society that's so unhappy with what's natural. How do we get back to being happy with what's natural? And I ask this because when I was 38 years old, I had breast cancer, so I had a double mastectomy, and I and then I had reconstruction. And you know, I look at it and it's obviously different than what I was as a natural woman, you know, and you have something else inside of your body and it's like, it feels different. It looks different. It's strange. And I don't like it, but I know that I did it because I was saving my life and otherwise the cancer would have killed me, you know? And so I think that for me, I'm like, okay, well, this is like the consolation. I'm doing this because I had to. But it breaks my heart for the people who, whether they are in your situation or young women who decided to have implants and have changed their body completely and think that that's the answer. And you're just, then you're trying to put the pieces back together. And I just don't know how we got here.
Yeah, I mean, it's so it's just sad because and that's why my book is called Surviving the Trans Myth. And there's a lot of myths in there. But one of the biggest myths is the suicide myth. These people really do believe that their bodies, that their breasts are a cancer. And it's obviously so disrespectful to women like yourself who actually have had to save their life by having their breasts removed. But then we have these delusional teenagers, and I will say it's not just their fault either. They are
No.
brainwashed by these doctors.
Exactly. And that is the part that breaks my heart because they didn't have to and somebody convinced them they did. I think that's harder. It's to me, I'm like so mad at these doctors. How could you do this? You know, it's not like they're ignorant to what happens to women that go through this because they know there's the me's out there. There's the people that have had to do it. And man, when I had to do it, I sat with my surgeon and I was like, tell me what this is like. Like, do I ever look like a woman again? How do I wear a bathing suit? All the things, the questions that you have, you know, and he went through in great detail. We've had so many women that we've had changed surgeries so much over the years. This is what it'll look like. This is what we can do. This is how we can keep this skin and that skin. And I mean, we went through it in great detail to try to make it seem like I could still be me, even though there was going to be a part of me missing. So it makes me mad because I think those guys sat with me, cried with me, and they were like, we're going to try to make this as normal as possible, knowing that it wasn't normal, you know? And then there has to be someone that's gone through that decided to cut off kids' breasts. How? I don't understand it.
I think a lot of like the surgeons are probably psychopathic and narcissistic, and they get a great charge for their egos to think, oh, I'm saving these kids' life. But at the same time, I think there are some surgeons that actually get sexual gratification mutilating young women's bodies because the way that they will do the surgeries so botched. I mean, me and my friends document this kind of stuff online. So we'll go through TikTok, trans TikTok, and look at these surgeries. I mean, it's like they're purposely harming these women, and
I've
the women
seen these
don't know it.
images too. I mean, I didn't really think of it that way, but now that you're bringing it up, I have seen these pictures of kids and I'm like, man, I went through the same surgery. I don't look like that at all. How could that be how they did this to these kids? Like these lines right across their chest. What is that?
Yeah, that's what my scars look like, and mine are relatively good compared to some of the surgeries, but it's like there's almost it's a queering, so it's an inversion of the normal and the good. And so beauty and ugliness are inverted and health and illness are inverted. And so there's almost it's almost a badge of honor to have scars. And you'll see like pop merchandise on Etsy or whatever, where these girls are selling t-shirts with self-harm scars, like the trans surgery scars. Because it's kind of like a badge of honor, like almost like being a warrior in a sense, like you're putting on some kind of war paint, because they really are struggling. They really do hate themselves. They're in a lot of pain and they're suicidal, and they really believe this is what's helping them survive. And so to them, it's like, oh, I had to cut off my breasts. I'm proud of that because it means that I'm loving myself so much. But to the rest of the normal world, and then to detransitioners who have kind of woken up from and left the cult, were horrified, because that's obviously not loving yourself. And a lot of these kids are autistic, and they have some kind of developmental issues where they're even more naive. So even though I was 19 and 20, I was suicidal and I was autistic, and had undiagnosed PTSD. So I wasn't functioning at all. I was not an adult whatsoever. And so, but legally they are. And they, even though I couldn't even legally drink alcohol, I could go and get my breast chopped off, even though I told the surgeon that I was suicidal. The surgeon didn't care because he was making money off of it. And there's no safeguards right now from any of the activist organizations or human rights organizations or pediatric organizations to say, hey, like, we need to do this ethically, and you can't just operate on anybody. Right now, it's a wild west of medicine.
So does that make you mad? I mean, at this point now, is that something you want to change? Is that because in Europe, they won't allow the surgeries anymore on kids. Now you are over 18, but is this something that you still feel like there needs to be a change? There needs to be some activism to stop this?
Yeah, absolutely. Me and other detransitioners, parents, and professionals across the world are really campaigning hard to raise awareness of this, to raise awareness of the lack of ethics being done in medicine. And so it doesn't matter if it's a minor or what age the person is. To be able to give consent, you actually have to have, number one, the mental faculty to consent. You can't be suicidal or in a deep mental distress. Number
Yeah.
two, the procedures actually have to have some kind of benefit. Like, if you're going to say this is
Yeah.
healthcare and bill this to insurance companies, and doctors are going to say this is mental health care, you have to actually have demonstrable outcomes that this improves health. Right now, we don't have any evidence. We don't have studies that show that this actually is life-saving care. Right now, it's cosmetic, it's horribly done cosmetic surgery paraded as healthcare and sold as snake oil to vulnerable people. And so I'm completely in support of a full ban of all, puberty suppressants, hormones, and surgeries for under 18s. And I would really like to ban it under 25 at least, because I don't think there's any outcomes to suggest that this actually helps anyone. But in terms of getting it classified as a cosmetic surgery, like a breast implant or a breast removal type situation, there needs to be some serious safeguards in place. And we already have precedents for that, like, for sterilization, if women want to get their tubes tied or things like that. So it's not like this is brand new.
Such a good point, because even to have a vasectomy, my husband and I had to be there. We had to have a conference. We had to both sign things like we've had kids. You couldn't, when we were young, you couldn't even do it if you hadn't had kids yet. Men were not legally allowed to do it. I'm like, I can't believe that this is just, you are stopping a child from going through puberty, changing their voices, permanently changing how their bodies function. It's just mind-boggling. And the fact that we can't say, does anybody else think this is pretty messed up? It's like, if you speak out, you are a terrible person. I mean, there's this congressman who came out, or senator, one of the two. I have to figure out what this guy's name is. He came out, I keep bringing him up. He came out and he was like, we're actually, as a Democrat, I'm not really allowed to say I don't want to have men and women's sports. It's like, why are we so afraid of saying, hey, anybody else think this is messed up? This is crazy.
Yeah, one term for it is suicidal empathy. So we're living in this culture where we have this empathy. Well, we must be so compassionate. We must be so tiptoeing around and walking on eggshells. Well, that's a narcissist paradise. So people who are narcissistic, they're demanding that you kowtow to anything that they want, any demand. And so it's misguided empathy. And so again, I think better than empathy is truth. That's what my advice is to everyone. Tell the truth as articulately, as plainly as you can, with your conviction and your values. That it doesn't matter if you can't control how someone reacts. You can only control if you're controlling your own behavior and your own words. And if you're acting and speaking with truth, then that's all that really matters. And that is real empathy. That is real compassion. I didn't need a doctor to tell me when I went to my follow-up appointment, wow, Laura, you're looking, so handsome with your flat chest. I didn't need him to lie to me about the mutilation that had just occurred. I needed somebody to tell me, wow, Laura, like, I'm really concerned for your well-being. Are you okay? So I'm so happy to see that whoever that guy is, I don't know if he's a congressman or a senator or what he is either, but that man that just spoke out, I mean, I am truly feeling so optimistic, even though I'm quite worked up right now. I'm feeling quite optimistic right now because we've been working for several years now to try and get public awareness of this. Now that we have conservative control over the government in pretty much every aspect, I mean, we're ready to get this done. Like we're done lying. We're done kowtowing to manipulation and emotional manipulation. The suicide threat is a myth. And I really believe that we are going to see more people speaking up and speaking out, because once you've had a child that cuts their breasts off, or once you've had your own breast cut off, or once you've been threatened to lose your license, if you're a therapist and you tell a patient that you think they should wait to heal their mental health before having their breast cut off, once you've been in that or known someone like that, you're never going to go back to lying again. And I think we just need more of these stories coming out because we need to stop lying.
Oh, I'm so proud of you. I mean, I don't know how you do it because it's so hard. I know from personal experience, it's hard to talk about what happened to you personally. It's hard to go out there and be vulnerable. And you're so young and you're so strong. And I'm just so impressed that you have come out and said, hey, this is not right. I have hope too. And I think that that's why we need to share our stories. I mean, and even my story, I share my cancer story because I know other people are going through it. And you are in the same situation. You know, other people are going through this. You know, they're still finding this. I mean, I know that kids in my daughter's school go through things like this. They go through these questions. And there's such a fear around having the conversation with kids. Thank you for doing this because it's helping people to not be afraid. That narcissism, I find that fascinating too, because it's true. It's like the narcissistic way is do not question me. Do not go against me. I know what's best. And you feel like, ooh, okay, we don't want to offend anybody. We're in this society that doesn't want to offend. So when do you think the book will be out? And give us the name of the book one more time.
So my book is called Surviving the Trans Myth. It's part memoir, part cultural analysis. And sometime next year, 2025, still working on it, but that's going to be out on Amazon. And if you want to make sure that you're keeping up with all the work I'm doing, which is way too many things, you can follow me on Twitter, Laura Becker Real. And if any parent or anyone is struggling with some kind of gender issue or you want to learn more, please email me at laurabeckerofficial@gmail.com. I welcome any inquiries that you might have.
Oh my gosh, that's great because I do think there are a lot of people that just don't know who to turn to. And I think that's the most important thing. Someone who's been through it, someone who's lived it, someone who understands it. And the fact that you are open to having these discussions and just having this conversation, honestly, it's been amazing. And I can tell you're an incredibly intelligent woman. And I just am so glad there are people like you out there. So I just want to thank you for coming on today.
Well, thank you so much. And I thank you for listening.
Absolutely. And thank you all for listening, as always, to the podcast. But thank you for listening today. And as you know, when you can find this podcast or others at the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. So join us next time on the Tudor Dixon podcast. Have a blessed day.